Hello, today I'm going to talk about maturitě question, which is called housing, living in the country and in the city. In my opinion, it is one of the easier maturitě questions because it gives you quite a lot of freedom. You can choose the topics and you can also choose the order in which you will talk about them. Today I'm going to give an example of how your answer to this question may look like. First of all, I'm going to be talking about housing in the Czech Republic. After that, I will move to describing the place I live in and the part of Prague I live in. And then I'm going to talk about some characteristics of living in the United Kingdom or the United States. Here you can also choose another English-speaking country and describe the living conditions there. And finally, I'm going to compare living in the country and in the city. At the end of the presentation, I will briefly mention some other possible topics you can mention as well. Let's start with housing in the Czech Republic. In the Czech Republic, if you live in the city, you are probably living in an apartment building or block of flats that is sharing the house with other people and other families. Or you live in a family house or family home. Here you can also talk about the advantages of living in a family house or the advantages of living in a block of flats. In Prague, in the city center, if you live there, you usually live in a block of flats or an old apartment buildings. And the further we move from the city center, the more probable it is that you live in a family house or family home. On the outskirts of Prague, there are what we call satellite towns. That means places where a lot of new houses were built recently. And also on the outskirts, we can find many villages which were independent at first, but slowly became engulfed in Prague, that is, became part of Prague as a city. When we are talking about apartment buildings, there are some new, recently built apartment buildings, and there are also old or even ancient apartment buildings. Well, they are not really ancient, but usually they were built pre-war. That means during the years of the First Czechoslovak Republic, but many of them were actually built at the end of the 19th century. And these buildings are, in my opinion, quite beautiful and have certain air or unique character. They also have many disadvantages. So, for example, if you live in an apartment block like this, there is a lot of reconstruction to be done, and this can cause some problems. If you live in a recently built apartment in a block of flats or apartment buildings, there are also many advantages, but some disadvantages you can mention as well. For example, the fact that these buildings are usually located further from the city center. In the Czech Republic, we have a special kind of building which is called panelák, and in English we would probably say that these are panel homes, panel houses, or maybe high-rise flat houses or high-rise apartment buildings. High-rise meaning that these buildings are usually quite tall, and these buildings are usually composed of many flats. High-rise buildings were built in the communist era, and their point was to provide quality living for a large number of people living in the city or moving to the city. Moving on, now I'm going to describe the place I live in. Well, talking personally, I would speak about living in an old apartment block, that is a block of flats in Prague 6. And I could mention the advantages, like being close to the city center, or having these lovely gardens inside the block of flats. And here you can also be personal and say the things you like about the place and the house you live in, or what are the things that you dislike and that can be improved. You can also describe the exterior of your home. So here you can show off some vocabulary knowledge of description of a house from the outside. This you should especially do if you have some interesting points to make, or if there are certain unusual or beautiful parts of your house you would like to mention. But mainly you should focus on the interior, because every house and every flat has a unique interior. The rooms are usually similar, but their composition is not. And you can also describe the furniture and the position of each room in your house or in your flat. Here you can also spend some time describing your room, since this is probably the place you spend most of your time in. This is also an opportunity for you to show some vocabulary skills. And just a small point here, we say ground floor in British English as přízemí, but in American English, přízemí is first floor. Then we have the second floor, third floor, and so on. At the end, there's the top floor. If this floor is under a roof, it can be called an attic or a loft. And under the ground, we can find a cellar or a basement. Moving on, you can also spend some time talking about housing in English-speaking countries, such as the United Kingdom or the United States of America. London, for example, is quite an interesting city, because in London, the old and the new is combined and blends in the city center. If you live in the central London, it is quite possible that you live in a recently built, modern glass and steel building. And it is equally probable that you live in an old building from Georgian or Victorian era. So London is quite an unusual city to inhabit in this way. What is maybe more typical is the English countryside, which is full of cozy, picturesque, and actually lovely villages composed of small houses. And if you are fond of English countryside, this is a good time to speak about it. However, English countryside is not just composed of cozy villages with small houses, but we also have these large homes, which are called country houses, and which were usually built and owned by members of British nobility or British aristocracy. This is still the case today, although at the end of the 19th and in the 20th century, these buildings were also constructed or bought by rich British businessmen, celebrities, or generally wealthy people. Living in these country houses must be quite nice because they are very spacious. They are composed of many and many rooms, and they are usually surrounded by garden and sometimes even hunting grounds. Talking about housing in the United States, there are quite some unique cities, such as New York City, which is full of skyscrapers. That means buildings even taller than high-rise buildings. And living there must be quite unusual and interesting experience. However, when we are talking about a middle class or upper middle class American family, they are usually living in these suburbs, and the part of the American dream is to have a family and to live in a house such as this one. That means a house with a small garden, sometimes a pool, and the neighborhood is usually further from the city center. I believe it is quite difficult to speak about housing in the United States in general because the country is so large, but this element of suburbs and family homes in the suburbs is something which is typical for many and many American states. And moving on to the last part of my talk, you can or you should focus here on comparing living in the country and living in the city. Here, it is important to stress your personal opinion. That means if you prefer living in the country or in the city, you should say so, and you should also give reasons. That means explain why do you think one is better than the other. You can take quite a strong position here, or you can say that both options have their advantages or disadvantages, but you should definitely spend some time talking about each option. I would like to start with the advantages of living in the city. For me, or in my opinion, I think the biggest advantage is that cities are also places full of cultural events, and it is not a problem to spend an evening in a theater or to go to the cinema and pick the movie you're interested in. And in the city center, there is usually a lot of places where musical events such as concerts and other gigs take place. Cities are also centers of education, and every major city usually have a university and a library or many libraries. So from a cultural perspective, living in the city is definitely better. If you compare this to living in the village, there is also a place where, let's say, culture happens, but the choice is usually minimal, and you have to be quite lucky to enjoy some cultural performance in a small village. There are not so many opportunities and not so many events. You can also mention other advantages of living in the city, such as the fact that cities are also places where large sports tournaments and sports events take place in stadiums or on football pitches. You can also choose from a variety of restaurants, pubs, and bars in the city. So the nightlife in the city is usually richer and more multifarious. Cities are also more ideal for shopping. You can go to shopping centers or department stores in the center, or you can go to some outlet stores on the outskirts of a city. And cities are also more interesting from the architectural point of view, because cities are usually full of old buildings composed of built in many interesting architectural styles. But let us focus now on the advantages of living in the country. There are many, and as I said, it is up to you which one to choose, but your personal opinion is very important. here. So, what are the advantages of living in the country? Cows are definitely one of the main advantages. If you're fond of cows or cattle, the village or the countryside is the place to be. It is possible to have cows in the cities as well, but it's usually very impractical and it causes a lot of problems. Cows can cause traffic jams, and cows are generally quite inconvenient to have in the city. It is inconvenient not just for the inhabitants, but for the cows themselves, since there is usually little grass for them to chew and to eat. Imagine that you live in a city, you have a busy day, and you're running late for a meeting. There is nothing worse than a pack of cows blocking the street and causing you delay and other troubles on the way. In the country, cows have many opportunities to eat, to rest, and country is generally calmer and quieter and more ideal for cows. There are, of course, other advantages of living in the country. Maybe some of them come to mind sooner than cows, such as the calmness and general quiet you can enjoy while living in the country. And as I mentioned, cities are usually very busy and it can be stressful or hectic experience to live in a city. Countryside has also far better quality of air, and whereas cities are quite often overrun by smoke, smoke is quite rare in the countryside. So for your lungs and maybe generally, it is more healthy to live in the countryside. Here, if you're interested in ecological matters, you can spend some time talking about this fact. I've always found interesting, for example, the fact that if you live in the capital city of Mexico, this Mexico City, just breathing the air there equals smoking 6 or 7 cigarettes a day. So if you live there and someone asks you if you smoke, you have to answer, well, I don't really have a choice, I do. And to finish, here are some other possible topics you can talk about while talking about this maturity question. You can focus on describing the architecture of a town or place you live in. You can say if you're happy with it or if you would prefer to live somewhere else because of this reason. You can also compare living in various cities. I have talked about London and the architectural style there. You can compare it with living in Prague or living in Paris, which is a definitely different experience. And as I said, the content of this question is from a large part up to you. So you can also choose some other things to talk about.